everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of this season of the podcast. Jim, we've been enjoying some fantastic weather here in Northern Ireland. I know you love sunbathing. I remember back to last summer, I believe it was, and there was a little incident where you maybe got a bit too much sun. I trust you've been looking after yourself this year.
Well, you know very well that I infinitely prefer grey, overcast skies. I mean, at the moment it's like living on Mars. I mean, I've even had to turn my Aga cooker off. But I still did manage to maintain a little tradition of my own, because as you know, yesterday was the anniversary of D-Day, when Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy and brought about the end of the Second World War. So every 6th of June, I watched that film, The Longest Day, as a sort of private tribute to the soldiers who saved us from tyranny. So that's how I've spent my week.
Okay, good. So that kept you out of the sun. So no,
that was the main reason.
No sun poisoning, I believe it was. We're all good. This season, Jim, we've been looking at Twitter storms, and we've been discussing some of the controversies that have blown up in the US amongst Christians in recent years. And this episode, to be honest, I'm somewhat nervous about, Jim, but I think it'll be exciting because we're going to talk about conspiracy theories. So be prepared for questions about QAnon and the Great Reset.
I really think we should give each other code names for this episode. And from now on, please refer to me as Brown Fox. But no, look, to be serious, I want to say up front that our aim is not to give some sort of sneering elitist commentary on these conspiracy theories. It's actually a really complicated subject. I have seen divisions over these theories ruin friendships and cause tensions in marriage. So our main aim in this episode is going to be pastoral. The people I have in mind are Christians who either believe in some of the big conspiracies or who have a loved one who has been persuaded by them.
Okay, that's helpful. We also want to make clear that not every unpopular opinion is a conspiracy theory. So sometimes that term is used unfairly as a way of shutting down debate. And it's actually perfectly reasonable to ask questions, isn't it, about the science behind various things like climate change or mask wearing or whether or not pandemic lockdowns did more harm than good. Like, it's okay to ask those questions, isn't it?
Yes.
It's actually healthy to apply critical thinking to these sorts of issues. So our first job actually is to define carefully the hallmarks of a real conspiracy theory.
Just as you were speaking, I remember there was a Hollywood actor, or there is a Hollywood actor called Kevin Sorbo. He amazingly happens to be a conservative, and he put out a funny tweet recently, and it said this, I need some new conspiracy theories because all my old ones have come true. There's actually an important point behind that joke, because not all conspiracy theories are necessarily wrong. I mean, think back to the Watergate scandal of the early 70s, the scandal that brought down President Richard Nixon. That was dismissed for quite a while as a conspiracy theory, and it was. It just happened to be true. So we have to do more than just work out how to identify a conspiracy theory. We're going to have to understand the critical thinking skills that help us decide whether or not a particular theory is true.
Brilliant. Well, as usual, we'll bring a bit of structure to this conversation, and we're going to break it into two halves. In the first half, we'll try and identify the key hallmarks of a conspiracy theory, and then we'll ask why people believe them. Then in the second half, we'll home in on the Christian community. The stats show that evangelical Christians seem to be especially prone to conspiracy theories. So let's ask why that might be, and then let's consider the answer, the logical way for Christian believers to actually evaluate conspiracy theories.
That sounds good. If we have time, Ollie, we'll just finish up with some pastoral advice on how to deal with a fellow believer who is a conspiracist. Okay.
Great. Well, before we get into the conspiracy theories that are popular today, let's go back and think about some older ones. I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with them. The Apollo moon landings. They were filmed on a soundstage in Arizona, weren't they, Jim? Area 51 is home to advanced alien technology. JFK was assassinated by the mafia. The terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers on 9/11 were orchestrated by the CIA. Princess Diana was assassinated by MI6. The New World Order is taking over, and so on. What do all these conspiracy theories have in common then, Jim? What are the key characteristics of a conspiracy theory?
Well, there seem to be three main characteristics, and the first one is that nothing is ever as it seems. Appearances are deceptive. The official story can't be trusted. And this is one of the main lures of conspiracies. Come with me, says the guide. I will peel back the tarp of history and show you what's really going on underneath the surface. Once you see the truth, you will be in the know. Now, that sort of promise is alluring because it can be difficult living with uncertainty. I was just thinking in Luke 17, the Lord Jesus warns us not to believe conspiracy theorists who claim to know when he will return. Just live with not knowing that information. Don't be seduced by the false teachers, is the message that the Lord gives us. So the first hallmark of a conspiracy theory is that nothing is ever as it seems. Appearances are deceptive.
That idea helps explain something about how conspiracy theories are structured. They nearly always begin with anomalies or unanswered questions in the official account of an event. So, for example, why did building number 7 collapse on 9/11 when it was not hit by a plane? Or just before President Kennedy was assassinated, why was there a mysterious man opening and closing an umbrella on a bright sunny day? It's those little unexplained details that then open up the deeper story that lies underneath the official one.
That's right. So that is the first characteristic. Nothing is ever as it seems. The second hallmark of a conspiracy theory is the most important of the three. And it's the idea of a secret cabal, a secret group of powerful people who run the show behind the scenes. There's a philosopher called Brian Keeley, I think he's based in California, and he defines a conspiracy theory like this. It's an explanation of historical events that has at its centre a small group of powerful people working in secret to accomplish some, usually evil, goal.
And that idea has the potential to change how we interpret everything in life, doesn't it? It can become the lens through which we view the world. How did the idea of a secret cabal come into the conversation?
Right. Well, let's go back to 1776. There was a law professor called Adam Weishaupt, and he started a secret society in Bavaria. And his colleagues didn't have much time for Weishaupt. One called him a clever, cantankerous, self-absorbed, and self-deceiving bore. There's an annual appraisement. And anyway, he had joined the Freemasons earlier, but he didn't think much of them. So on the 1st of May, 1776, he met with 4 of his students to form a secret society, which he called the Illuminati. And within a few years, the membership had risen to about 300. But rumours of sedition came to the attention of the authorities, and so Weishaupt fled the country, and the organisation collapsed. But the mythology lived on. Now, Europe at this time, of course, was horrified by the news of the French Revolution. So maybe it wasn't all that surprising that commentators began to blame the Illuminati for the revolution in France. Their aim, wrote one writer, is universal dissolution, the overthrow of society and religion itself. And it's that little bit of history that laid the foundation for this idea of a mysterious cabal within the elite, a group of puppet masters who pull the string of history. So the Illuminati provide the genesis of the idea of a secret cabal. But a later conspiracy took the idea to a new level. Now, I was just thinking, Ollie, it's been a long time since I presented you with an utterly random historical fact.
I'm looking forward to it.
So we all know the man called Henry Ford, yes, the founder of the Ford Motor Company. Did you know that Adolf Hitler kept a framed photo of Henry Ford on his desk?
Wow. Yeah, I haven't really heard that before, to be honest.
Well, let me explain why. It's a very bizarre fact. But the reason for it is that both men promoted a conspiracy theory. So imagine you take the theory we've just talked about, okay, this shadowy cabal called the Illuminati, but now you add in a concentrated dose of anti-Semitism. Mix those two explosive ideas together, and you get what was called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, according to that conspiracy theory, an elite cabal of Jews, powerful men in finance and politics, had been controlling history for centuries, and their dastardly plan was coming to a climax. So the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it was claimed to be an internal strategy document that had been leaked by a Russian agent. There are 24 of the protocols, and according to them, world domination would be brought about using assassinations, fostering discord, starting futile wars, and spreading plagues. Now, the most important thing to say about the protocols is that they are a complete fake, a forgery invented by a Russian spy who wanted to stir up anti-Semitic feelings in his own country. He shamelessly plagiarized entire passages from a couple of novels that had been written 50 years earlier. But the conspiracy theory was promoted heavily by people like Henry Ford. Okay? Millions of copies were sold and distributed across the world. At one point, it was second only to the number of copies of the Bible sold. And even though the forgery was proven beyond dispute by 1921, Adolf Hitler began quoting the protocols in his speeches, and when he rose to power, the protocols of the Elders of Zion were put on the German school syllabus, and the rest, as they say, is history.
The notion of a secret group is very powerful because our brains are wired to look for intentionality. We instinctively explain things in terms of personal agency. So the idea that history unfolds in accordance with the will of a secret cabal is actually quite appealing. It explains things in personal terms. There's no allowance given for accidents, stupidity, ignorance, or administrative failure.
That's right. We don't want to think that our lives are merely the result of random chance. If that was the case, we would have no hope of comprehending or predicting or controlling our own fate. So this idea of a secret group of clever, powerful and evil people is quite appealing. Now, mind you, anyone who's ever worked in a large organisation would struggle to believe that any group of human beings, even super-intelligent villains, could be so successful and united. Nearly everything governments do can be explained as a series of gigantic, stupid mistakes. I'm reminded of that brilliant line from Yes, Prime Minister. Sir Humphrey says, "It would be different if the government was a team rather than a loose confederation of warring tribes." But I guess people who've never tried to implement strategies can believe things that jaded cynics like me cannot.
What's the third characteristic of a conspiracy theory, Jim?
Well, the third characteristic is that it is irrefutable. Someone once said that arguing over a conspiracy theory is like wrestling with a greased pig. It always seems to be able to squirm away and avoid being disproved. A good example of this comes from the assassination of JFK, because everybody agrees that the assassin, who is Lee Harvey Oswald, was an unreliable, eccentric man. The Russians gave up on him. But his unreliability would have made him obviously a poor choice, even as a patsy. But conspiracy theorists rebutted that charge by saying that the choice of Lee was evidence of the sheer brilliance of the real assassins. By employing an unreliable amateur, the conspirators set up a cunning deception to throw investigators off the scent. Okay? Anyway, Ollie, those are the three big characteristics of a conspiracy theory. Things are never what they seem. There's a secret cabal controlling things behind the scenes, and the theory is irrefutable. It always seems to dance around any attempt to disprove it.
Okay, let's turn now to the conspiracy theories that are popular today. So the most famous one is known as QAnon, and then there is the latest one called the Great Reset.
Okay, we'll start with QAnon. But to understand that, we actually need to go back to 2016 and think about an earlier conspiracy called Pizzagate. So this theory accused Hillary Clinton of running a child sex ring in Washington, D.C. According to the Pizzagate conspiracy, references and emails to pizza were actually coded messages between high-profile Democrats about child trafficking and abuse. And the hub of the ring was claimed to be in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. called Comet Ping Pong.
And that theory had dramatic consequences. In 2016, a Christian father of two called Edgar Madison Welch arrived at the restaurant armed with a semi-automatic rifle and fired some shots. He then discovered that the restaurant didn't actually have a basement.
Yeah, so that brings us to QAnon. QAnon has been described as the sequel to Pizzagate. The QAnon conspiracy theory claims that former President Donald Trump is secretly battling a cabal of Satan-worshipping paedophile Democrats. It's claimed that Trump was recruited by a group of generals in the American military to run for the presidency to bring down this secret cabal. So according to the theory, the conflict will come to a head in a moment called the storm, when Trump will finally unmask the cabal, punish its members for their crimes, and restore America to greatness. And Trump actually himself referred to that cleverly when he talked that this is the calm before the storm. The QAnon conspiracy began back in October 2017 when an anonymous account called Q posted on a message board called 4chan. And Q claims to be this high-ranking government insider with access to classified information. But the theory has morphed over time, so it now includes the JFK assassination, 9/11, and the claim that the election of 2020 was rigged.
QAnon is hugely popular in the US. Twitter removed over 70,000 accounts related to QAnon after the January 6th riot on Capitol Hill. YouTube videos that explained QAnon were viewed millions of times before they were taken down.
Okay, so let's now think about the later theory, which is known as the Great Reset. In June 2020, there was an annual conference held at Davos, the Swiss ski resort. I mean, that's the conference where the wealthy business and political figures of the world fly in on their private jets to berate little people like you and me about the evils of flying. Anyway, at the 2020 conference, the head of the World Economic Forum was joined on stage by Prince Charles, now King Charles, and the two men said that the global pandemic had given the world the opportunity to reset. That's where the Great Reset comes from. In other words, to reimagine our approach to the future, to build a green, sustainable, and more equitable economy. And the pandemic at that conference was described as a needed crisis.
The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau published a controversial video in which he expanded on the Great Reset idea. His vision was a strange blend of material about how to respond to the pandemic and a globalist, socialist vision of a new world order.
Now, the first thing to say about the Great Reset is that if I had to pick two men to reshape human history, Prince Charles and Justin Trudeau would not be top of my list. I mean, I don't want to be a disloyal British subject, but even his closest allies wouldn't describe His Majesty as the sharpest pencil in the pencil case. Anyway, nonetheless, a conspiracy theory was spawned by the Davos announcement. According to the Great Reset theory, the global pandemic was a deliberate move to condition us all to accept global social coercion. The Davos elite were taking the first step towards a socialist world government. The rise of the Antichrist was on the horizon, and once again, Donald Trump was seen as the only man who could save us from this sinister plot.
Now, some of our listeners might be thinking at this point, Jim, doesn't the Bible indicate a world government of sorts will one day arise, along with a sinister figure known as the Antichrist?
It does say that. But the Great Reset, it seems to me, is a childish parody of that biblical prophecy. In other words, the theory takes a deep biblical idea and trivializes it. I was personally quite worried by the authoritarian impulse in Western governments revealed by the pandemic. There's a really serious conversation to be had about lockdowns and the stifling of debate over vaccines. I mean, the links between government agencies and the media were downright Orwellian. The ongoing attempts to create a global vaccine passport are frightening. But a thoughtful debate on those issues gets lost in the foolish allegations that vaccinations contain microchips that allow us to be controlled by 5G networks.
I guess the obvious question is, why do people believe in conspiracy theories? It would be ignorant of us to label conspiracists as a fringe group of crackpots who wear tinfoil hats, because many intelligent people who hold down very responsible jobs have been drawn into the world of conspiracy theories. They could never be described as nuts or irrational. So how does someone come to believe these things?
There seem to be three main reasons. The first is what we might call the lure of being in the know. Proverbs 18 verse 8 is crucial in this context. It says, "The words of a whisperer are like tasty morsels, and they go down into a person's innermost parts." Conspiracy theories are like gossip. They have the same allure, a sort of fascination which comes from knowing things that other people don't know. C.S. Lewis called it the desire to be in the inner ring. It's one of the great attractions offered by Christianity's oldest enemy, the thing called Gnosticism. Gnostics promised its followers access to secret knowledge. It was an elitist project that created an inner ring. So one big psychological reason why conspiracy theories attract us is the lure of being in the know.
Another reason is a desire for meaning in life. Our culture offers us no objective meaning, and in a meaningless world, people can feel invisible and unmoored from any shared sense of purpose. People who live in the conspiracy world admit that they enjoy participating in the community of sleuths, a group of fellow-minded detectives searching out the truth. So even if I experience disappointment and anxiety in my work or family life, I'm still a virtuous defender of the innocent and a righteous warrior for justice.
In that sense, conspiracists aren't all that different from people who escape existential boredom by living in the world of online gaming. Now, the third reason is the most important, and unfortunately it might offend those who live in the world of conspiracy theories. The deepest reason why some people become conspiracists is out of envy of the powerful. Academic studies have proven that there is a clear correlation between how powerless people feel and how prone they are to conspiracy thinking. There's nearly always a deep resentment against what we might call the establishment. And resentment like that can arise if deep down I would love to have power myself. People who idolize power usually explain events in terms of power. I interpret an event as a power move because that's what I would like to do if I had power. Now, I know that is a hard analysis to accept, but it is a common theme in the literature. I mentioned Hitler and the Protocols of Zion earlier. Now, his reaction to the Protocols is fascinating. He wrote it in a diary. This is what he said. The Protocols appalled me. The stealthiness of the enemy. I saw at once that we must copy it. In our own way, of course. We must beat the Jew with his own weapon. He believed the conspiracy theory because it was what he would love to do himself.
So we've thought about the three main reasons why people can be drawn into the world of conspiracy theories. There is the lure of being in the know. There is a desire for meaning. And then there is the envy of the powerful. I want to turn to the second half of our discussion now, Jim, and think specifically about the relationship between conspiracy theories and the evangelical Christian community. The stats show that US evangelicals are more prone to believing in conspiracy theories than any other group. The Economist ran a study on the theory that vaccines contain microchips that track individuals. They found that far more evangelicals believed that theory than anyone else. 50% of Republicans believed that the 2020 election was rigged. But a survey of evangelicals saw that percentage rise to 70%. In wider American society, 14% of people would call themselves QAnon believers, but 22% of evangelicals call themselves QAnon believers. That's over 1 in 5 evangelicals.
Those are astonishing figures. I mean, we do need to remember that evangelicalism in the US is a cultural thing. So there are many people who call themselves evangelical who never darken the door of a church. But your point still stands. Christians do seem to be particularly vulnerable to belief in conspiracy theories.
And do you have any thoughts on why that is? What makes evangelicals prone to believing these theories?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of 2 reasons. The first is that the biblical concept of the world has become corrupted. So the Apostle John talks a lot about the world in his gospel. We actually did an episode on that, didn't we? The Lord Jesus himself tells us that the world will hate us the way it hated him. But remember that the Bible sees the world as a value system. It's a set of values that emerge when you say this world is all there is. You know, there is no God, there's no human soul, there's nothing but physical stuff. The world is that system which cuts us off from God and spiritual realities. But far too many Christians today think of the world as a group of people. In a polarized society, it's us versus them, and the them equals the world, and that is a distortion of a biblical concept.
The Bible has a nuanced view of the state. In the book of Daniel, it is seen as both good and necessary, but it is also portrayed as an amoral beast. In the New Testament, Paul urges us to pray for those in authority. The state has a God-given role to allow people to live in peace. So we shouldn't equate the state with the Bible's concept of the world.
That false equation led an evangelical candidate for Congress to frame the debate over masks as a choice between having faith in God or becoming an ally to a group of Marxist globalist Satanists. That's a direct quote. We never forget Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous quote. The line between good and evil runs not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Once we start to believe that conservatives wear the white cowboy hats and everyone else wears a black cowboy hat, then we develop what one academic has called Teflon hermeneutics.
You'll have to explain that to me, Jim.
Well, Teflon is a material used in non-stick pans, right? So a Teflon hermeneutic is a way of interpreting events that is impervious to change because nothing ever sticks. I mean, why should I give any weight to academic studies on vaccines if I already know that the authors are government stooges, part of the great group of people called the world? Teflon hermeneutics insulates me from the normal, shared social context in which reasonable discourse occurs. It encourages me to dismiss any view which originates outside the ghetto. Now, please don't misunderstand me here. I am not saying that we should just slavishly accept every edict or guidance that comes from the state. I do personally wonder sometimes if the whole vaccine program was a little rushed. It's good and proper to continue to ask questions about potential side effects. But the way to go about that task is to stand in the public square and engage in reasonable dialogue. The real problem is that polarization in society increases our reliance on familiar and comfortable voices, and creating echo chambers. And that can lead people to insulate themselves from those with whom they disagree. So they become like Teflon. Nothing will ever change their minds because nothing will ever stick.
So next time someone comes to me with a conspiracy theory, I'm going to tell them they have Teflon hermeneutics, and I'm sure they'll be really be rolled back by that.
We may have created another conspiracy theory beyond the Great Reset.
Oh dear. We said a minute ago that there were two reasons why Christians are especially prone to belief in conspiracy theories. The first reason is that the biblical concept of the world has been corrupted. But the second reason is that a lot of these conspiracy theories use religious language and religious concepts. So they become almost like a syncretistic religion, a mix of true and false religion.
It's really interesting just how often Q uses religious language when he posts his QAnon updates. If America falls, darkness will follow, he says. He couches the struggle as a battle between children of light and children of evil. Q commands his followers to stand at the flag and kneel at the cross. He draws a battle line between patriots and Satanists. He even publishes prayers, and his favourite sign-off is, God wins.
That line about a battle between patriots and Satanists shows the syncretism I was talking about. QAnon is a form of Christian nationalism which reduces Christianity to a power struggle over Christian values, but that's not the gospel, is it?
It's an utterly false gospel. QAnon's religion is simply a vehicle for gaining and maintaining power. The point you're making here, Ollie, links back to our previous episode on the new atheists. And the more I thought about that episode, the more I realised how perilous it is to reduce the gospel to a fight over Christian values. The gospel is about how the Lord Jesus overcame sin and death. The huge risk we face in these days doesn't actually come from the progressive left. I think it comes from forming an alliance with right-wing humanists, because an alliance like that will create a syncretistic religion that's dedicated to winning control of a nation's values, and that ain't the gospel.
We said at the start of this conversation that we wanted to approach it pastorally. There may be listeners who themselves have become embroiled in conspiracy theories, or perhaps a listener who has a loved one or friend who is a conspiracist. I guess the obvious question, Jim, is what's the answer? We've done a fair amount of analysis here, but is there a way to handle conspiracy theories well? There seems to be this unbridgeable chasm between those who accept them and those who sneer at them. Is there a better way?
Yes, there is. The way out of this impasse is to ask the basic question, is the theory true? As Christians, we are called to love the truth. That's why Scripture issues such severe warnings to false prophets. So we should follow the advice of 1 Thessalonians and test everything. In other words, use our intellectual faculties well. As Christians, we are called to love the Lord our God with our minds, and we do that by practicing intellectual virtue. Some of the worst vices are intellectual vices. We can be intellectually arrogant or intellectually lazy. So I'm going to get really, really practical here. I'm going to offer up 5 questions that will test the truthfulness of any conspiracy theory. And if you're troubled by these matters, then you might even want to get a pen and paper and jot the 5 questions down. And here they are. 1. Do I have good evidence? 2. Have I addressed counter-arguments? 3. Am I being intellectually arrogant? 4. Am I slandering anyone? 5. Am I trusting God as I think?
Okay, let's go through those questions one by one and unpack them a bit. So let's take the first question. Do I have good evidence?
The best way to understand this is to imagine that you're in a courtroom. Do you have evidence that will stand up in court? If all I have is conjecture, wishful thinking, blind leaps, hunches and gut feelings, then my evidence is weak and inconclusive. Weaving an elaborate story around a few anomalies in another story is not good evidence. So I'm going to take an example here. Let's take the example of Pizzagate. The theory that there are, tunnels running under the White House that are used in the child sex trade. Hillary Clinton stands accused of leading a cabal of satanic child molesters. Now imagine that Clinton has taken the promoter of that theory to court. She's claiming defamation of character. And I want you to imagine that you are the defense attorney. What actual evidence, good evidence, do you have?
Your second question was, have I addressed the counter-arguments? Tell us a bit more about that.
Ask yourself, am I being consistent and even-handed in the way I treat counter-arguments and objections and news sources? This question flushes out what's called confirmation bias, when somebody chooses only to read authors who agree with their position. So are you reading opponents? Let me take another example here. It is strange that Building 7 collapsed on 9/11, because the idea that fire could melt steel seems improbable. But have you actually read the structural engineers' reports on Building 7? I have. And I had to hang on by my fingernails when they discussed the connector's abilities to resist gravity loads but not thermally induced lateral loads. But the evidence that persuaded me came from another building collapse cited in the latest reports. The Plasco Tower in Tehran did collapse because steel melted on fire. Now, my point here, Ollie, is that the Christian thing to do, the intellectually virtuous thing to do, is to engage with one's opponents. Conspiracists are fond of saying, I do my own research. Well, that's good, provided that you address all the defeater arguments.
The third question you asked is really direct. It confronts us with the possibility that we're being intellectually arrogant.
Christians should exercise intellectual humility. So it's always good to test ourselves by asking, am I being rigid or dogmatic or unyielding? So here is the absolutely key question to ask any conspiracist. What sort of evidence would change your mind? Or you might ask, is your theory falsifiable? Now, if those questions bounce off the conspiracist like a tennis ball bouncing off a brick wall, I should really have used my Teflon analogy, but anyway, then you're almost certainly dealing with an intellectually arrogant person. And there's one other point here. A mark of an intellectually virtuous person is that sometimes they will say, I don't know enough to have an opinion on that subject. I'm outside of my sphere of competence. I mean, take the allegation that automatic voting machines were rigged in the 2020 election. In order to take that charge seriously, I would need you to explain the inner workings of a voting machine, the safeguarding protocols around vote recording, and the processes around vote notifications from remote stations. That's an awful lot of IT and hardware design to understand.
Your fourth question related to the risk of slandering others. Pastor Greg Locke of Global Vision Church in Nashville has millions of followers on social media. And he once preached a sermon in which he claimed there are child trafficking tunnels under the White House, that Tom Hanks and Oprah Winfrey are pedophiles, that Trump won the 2020 election. We have to be very careful about making claims like that. The Apostle Paul warns us not to be slanderers or inventors of evil.
I mean, the virulent abuse, the outright slanderous allegations thrown at well-known political figures in the US is shocking, and Christians should never engage in that sort of behaviour. There's just so much contempt around these days, Ollie. I mean, people utterly despising other people, even between professing believers. And we need to be really careful about that. I remember once being pulled up by those stern words of the Lord Jesus in Matthew 5. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell.
Your final question is, am I trusting God as I think? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think Christians should face the world today with a sense of quiet confidence. We know who holds the future. We know how the story will end. So if I find myself roiled up with anger, full of rage or despair or anxiety, then an alarm bell should go off in my mind. If you can't discuss your conspiracy theory with God, then it means that deep down you know it's not of God. I mean, remember the Lord Jesus himself was the victim of a conspiracy theory. As he waited in the Garden of Gethsemane for his betrayer to come, we watch him kneel to pray. We hear the words, Abba, Father. So that is the real litmus test. Are you what James calls a double-minded man? One moment an angry conspiracist, the next a saved child of God? Or can your mind process conspiracy thinking in God's presence?
I mentioned Pastor Greg Locke just now. CBS broadcast a documentary on Locke and his conspiracy theories, and Locke defended his views by saying this: Christians have always believed things that the world thought, that is nuts, these people are crazy. They are absolutely crazy. He was replying to a question about his responsibilities to give evidence for his claims.
That's an awful defense, isn't it? I mean, he's saying, you think my conspiracy theories are nuts? Well, Christianity is even more nuts in your eyes.
That approach raises a really big question for Christians. Many non-Christians put the odd beliefs of Christianity on par with QAnon. It's just one more conspiracy theory, they might say. History is controlled by a secret cabal of unseen spiritual forces. The world is not what it appears to be, and one day the storm will come when evil will be exposed and punished. You believe this conspiracy theory for the same reasons people believe the other ones. You want meaning in life. You feel powerless and out of control. And then you hide yourself away in a Christian bubble and dismiss anyone who tries to counter your conspiracy theory. You're a Christian because you only allow yourself to listen to other Christians. How would you persuade someone who said those things that there's a difference? What is the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth claims of Christianity?
Well, the answer is to make sure that in your evaluation of Christianity, you employ the intellectual virtues that we've just talked about. Do you have good evidence? Have you addressed the counter-arguments? Have you been intellectually arrogant? If your faith rests on nothing more than conjecture, wishful thinking, blind leaps, hunches, and gut feelings, then you don't have good evidence. As the Apostle Peter says, we must be able to give a reason for the living hope we have. I mean, that's, after all, Ollie, why we have ploughed through all those episodes on the Bible and the Trinity and the person of Christ and the cross and the resurrection. Our Christian faith is exposed and out in the open. Do your best to tear it down, we say. Throw everything you've got at it. And for 2,000 years, people have done just that. But the coherence, the explanatory power of Christianity is untouched. And at its very centre, we find Jesus Christ, the very source of truth. In Christ, we encounter that which is ultimately real, and we hold him up for all the world to see.
Just to close, Jim, let's think about the pastoral situation where a young woman perhaps finds that her husband has fallen into the world of conspiracy theories. What should she do in that scenario?
Well, the first thing is not to become angry or dismissive. Psychologists recommend the 3 Ps in situations like this. Paraphrase, praise, and probe. So begin by listening respectfully without interrupting. Then paraphrase what you've heard. So what you're saying is that right? And then secondly, find something positive to say. I mean, you've clearly done a lot of reading in this. But then probe gently. And remember the question I mentioned earlier. What sort of evidence would change your mind? And if you feel that your loved one is willing to listen, perhaps share the 5 intellectual virtue questions I suggested that you write down and leave him to think it through for himself, and then pray.
Sometimes it might even be good to draw a loved one away from the computer. In Philippians 4, Paul says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." So we can use our imagination to think of good and positive activities and conversations that we can share together away from conspiracy theories.
That's right. Now, Ollie, given everything that we have discussed, I feel embarrassed to admit that I suspect that you may have ensnared me in a conspiracy theory.
Jim, I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. Why do you suspect that?
I very much fear that the vote on our new opening theme music will be rigged.
No comment. No comment at this time, Jim.
As a precaution, I'm writing to Elon Musk and asking him to buy Instagram.
You're going to go rogue and host the podcast on Instagram like everyone seems to be doing with their shows now. But Jim, on the topic of intro music, I've had a little bit of feedback on your music, your last piece of theme music, the Parisian themed music, for those who remember. Let me just read you out some of the thoughts from a few of our listeners. One person says it was the most culture I've experienced in weeks. So they obviously enjoyed it. Someone else just sent 3 clapping hands. That means they enjoyed it, really appreciated it. Someone else said, having re-listened, it's got better, but we're not French.
That is a very strong counter-argument. You know that brilliant line in Yes, Prime Minister, when was the last time we got our way with the French? 1815, the Battle of Waterloo.
There you go. Well, this person, Robbie,
I'm undermining myself.
This person, Robbie, has actually just come out with a winning argument there. Thanks, Robbie. I really appreciate that. We've got someone else here who says, I don't know if it fits a podcast necessarily, but it was actually really good music. A very balanced opinion. Our listeners are very balanced.
They are.
That's one thing I appreciate about them. A guy called Tom listened to it at an airport in France and says it was a surreal experience. And then I had another private message from someone, Jim, who said it's the kind of music that you would hear in a nursing home. So I...
That is a gross insult. A gross insult.
So I don't know. How do you feel about that feedback?
I'm shocked by the last one, and I know you left it to the last one because that's hideous. That's hideous.
Okay, well, with that feedback in mind, I mean, you've had two good shots at it. This is going to be your third attempt at a winning piece.
See, the problem is, Ollie, you are going to rig this so that whatever happens, the dooba dooba doo song will fail.
That is true, but no. I mean, you have one more shot at it today, Jim. This is the third piece.
Okay. Well, I thought I had a twinge of conscience, and I thought we should maybe, as a third option, do something because the other two are friendly and happy.
Uh-huh.
And I thought we could do something that suits your melancholic disposition, and which is a little pretentious like mine.
Okay.
And so I went back to a piece of music that we played in our church history series, and it's played on a medieval instrument called a hurdy-gurdy. Right? Now, this would actually fit quite well because I've never played a hurdy-gurdy, but I did play medieval instruments and Renaissance instruments. So here it is.
Personally, Jim, I think that is a glorious piece of music. I mean, I love the fact the instrument's called a hurdy-gurdy to begin with. My only question is, why can't we have our intro as you playing a hurdy-gurdy?
Well, maybe when I get to my nursing home, I'll do that. I mean, but what you're doing here, Ollie, is you're loading the bases so that you're praising this so that number one cannot win. So my message to our listeners is dooba dooba doo.
Yeah, and on that bombshell that Jim has become a conspiracy theorist, it's time to end this episode. Thank you, dear listeners, for your courteous attention. We're going to issue a poll in the coming days, so do look out for that. And we will get Jim's reaction to the results of that poll in the next episode. But yeah, vote wisely is all I can say. Anything else you want to say just to persuade our listeners of your preferred choice?
How many times can you vote on Instagram?
You can set up Jim will be setting up multiple accounts. I'm actually concerned about rigging now. Right, that's it. Goodbye and have a very good week.